there were people over in Asia known as the Scythians. An area or region is called Scythia, Scythia, and they used it as a kind of they used cannabis in their funerary rites. And like after a funeral or something, they were known to have gathered in an interior space, presumably a small one, and thrown massive amount of the leaf on the fire. And then Herodotus makes a point of saying that then they howled in joy. So they just filled the whole room and got ridiculously, altered and into a sort of an ecstatic space.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got a great show in store for you today. I want to remind you very quickly, go on over to savannahspirit.com/contest, enter into the weekly contest. Each week, you get a chance to win a $100 gift prize. Our show today, we are going to continue a conversation that we started a while back. It was actually episode 96 when we had author and teacher Stephen Gray on the show to talk about cannabis and spirituality. And we're going to continue that conversation today. We'll dive in more to the pharmacokinetics of cannabis, its ceremonial and ritual uses, its use in a more popular sense for creativity, as well as a lot of other things around the topic of cannabis and spirituality. I hope you enjoy this episode. Our guest today is Stephen Gray, who's actually a return guest on our show. He's a teacher and author who wrote Returning to Sacred World, a spiritual toolkit for the emerging reality, as well as co-authored and edited Cannabis and Spirituality, an explorer's guide to an ancient plant spirit ally. Excited to have him back on the show again. Stephen, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be back and chat more about these things, these matters.
So for those that haven't listened, our previous episode together was episode 96, and obviously they can hear the beginning parts of this continued conversation that we'd be having now. And they can also get a little bit more about your background. But for those that haven't heard that episode, could you give us just a real brief glimpse into your background and what's kind of brought you to this work that you're doing now?
Brief, eh? You think that's possible? Okay. Well, I've long been interested in the entheogenic or psychedelic medicines, and I've been also co-organizing the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver, which is a wonderful conference that I encourage people to come to. We get a lot of people from California coming up to speak at it, and some participants as well. And as part of that work, I had a very interesting conversation with one of our remarkable presenters, Kathleen Harrison, several years ago. And at the time, I was thinking that while cannabis is spreading very rapidly throughout cultures and gaining legal recognition and recognition for its medicinal benefits and so on, there was one aspect of the use of cannabis which was getting seriously short-shrifted, and that was its use as a spiritual ally or spiritual medicine, despite the fact that that use is ancient and extensive on this planet. And so I mentioned this to Kathleen in a conversation we were having, that I wanted to do something about this, but I didn't feel like I had a whole book in me by myself about it. She said, well, if you put a book together like that, I would contribute to it. And she's a beautiful writer, although she's never written a book. She's a lovely writer, very knowledgeable and insightful and wise human being, and also very knowledgeable about cannabis, as well as all these other, or a number of other entheogenic medicines. So that kind of, that was the push that I needed to commit to the project. And 4 years later or so, 3 or 4 years later, I had 17 contributors, plus the parts that I've written, and got really lucky with actually probably my favorite publisher, Inner Traditions, Park Street Press, Bear and Company. So yeah, the purpose in a sentence or so is to readdress or redress what you might call the oversight that cannabis is actually, when used wisely, carefully, respectfully, a very powerful spiritual medicine with great potential for humanity.
And I really appreciate that in the context that, as you mentioned yourself, the conversation in the social sphere these days tends to either be purely around the medicinal benefit for it, or because it's getting legalized recreationally in some states, just the recreational side of it, in the same way that people go out and they have a beer or a drink at a bar or something. And as you said, there's no real conversation in there about the spiritual uses of this medicine, which I think is sad. It is, as you mentioned, kind of a massive oversight. So I'm glad that you and others are bringing this conversation to the forefront more, to recognize that there are things other than just the hey, this can help with this particular medical condition, or that, or hey, have a joint to unwind. Like, there are actual benefits for it that can help people in their lives in real ways, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I want to start there a little bit today, talk about the pharmacology, or specifically the pharmacokinetics, in essence, how cannabis is moving around in the body, how it's interacting within the body, and how that might shed some light on why cannabis is such a powerful spiritual medicine.
Yeah, well, from the physiological point of view, that is sort of the ground or the starting point, right? And what I'm going to say is going to be brief, and it's also going to be a sort of a layperson's quasi, at best, scientific description of what happens. And this is primarily, not solely, but primarily based on Joan Bellows' description. Joan Bellows, the author of The Benefits of Marijuana, and 3 books, something like The Yoga of Marijuana, and a couple more that have just come out recently. And she's also a contributor to Cannabis and Spirituality. Her chapter, I think, is called Marijuana and the Body Mind. So the way Joan describes it is that when we're talking, we got to separate oral ingestion from inhalation methods, for starters. So this is inhalation methods in particular. When you first smoke or vaporize, within seconds, there's an increase in the heart rate. Depending on the dosage, she says it's a slight increase, but I've experienced with stronger doses that it can really get the heart going. So, by the way, it's important to recognize that's happening if you notice it, so that you don't go, oh my God, something weird is happening. It's a natural function of taking the substance in. And what that does is it pumps more blood more quickly, and more freshly oxygenated blood throughout the whole organism. And the way Joan talks about it is that it relaxes and releases what she calls the oppositional or skeletal musculature, allows the lungs to take in more air, which then increases the flow of blood even more. And this, by the way, would be a simple explanation for why people tend to find listening to music enhanced, right? I compose music, not so much anymore, but when I'm working on a piece on my computer, I'll often, after several days of just working away on it in a, quote, straight condition, I'll have a puff or two and listen back to the tracks that I've laid down, like, 7 or 8 tracks or whatever. And then I find, I'm hearing things that I just physically, literally did not hear before, under the influence of the plant. And of course, the famous munchies stimulates appetite, which is also part of its medicinal benefits, of course, and things seem to taste better, and on and on. Sense experience can be enhanced because of this increase of blood flow throughout the whole system. And I don't know if I can do this one quite justice. People might have to read this from Joan herself in the book. I haven't looked at it lately, but she talks about a balancing. Actually, she's not the only one who talks about this. They also talk about homeostatic balance in the cells that's created by cannabis. As Joan puts it, it's neither stimulant or depressant, but combines those two functions together and balances the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system and the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. So it creates a balance and an energized equilibrium. Okay, so the really simple way to put that is that it amplifies. So then the question then is, what do you do with that amplification? And this is a big part of what this book is about, is how do you channel that, intention, your intention and attention. So you were talking a little earlier about, people using cannabis for any old purpose, right? Well, in my experience, and I'm not alone in this, of course, if you have a couple of puffs and you've got a whole bunch of distractions going on externally and internally, in the sense that you're thinking and so on and so on, you won't notice the power of it, or you're not likely to notice the power of it in the same way whatsoever. I mean, even for myself, my typical pattern, it changes, but that I use the plant often twice a week. And sometimes one of those times is playing music with a friend, and we try to create a little ceremony out of that as well, with some silent sitting time in between and so on. But I usually try to get once a week in where I'm just sitting alone with it. And sometimes I'll actually make it into a more formal little private ceremony where I ding the gong 3 times and stuff. So what I've noticed is I like to sit in silent meditation for part of the time that I do that. And thoughts come. It's not like I'm empty of thoughts all the time, but keep coming back to the silence. But then if I actually sort of do something like pick up my guitar or whatever, then I'm channeling that energy into that. And that's good too. That's fine. But I don't notice the power of the plant in the same way. It's like I'm channeling it into this external focus. If you can do nothing for a little while, if you can just work on letting your thoughts go and just sit in silence. Yoga can be good for that too. But the real pure way, so to speak, the kind of least cluttered, least distracted way to meet the plant fully is to just be in silence with it, sitting, or even adding minimal kind of mind-body functions, like, say, walking in the woods, in a situation where you're not going to get into chats necessarily, or your way and you feel safe and comfortable there. You're not concerned about getting lost or running into bears or whatever, it can be similar, So it's that amplification function. It can open up the system. It can open up sharpness of insight. It can open up the heart, by releasing the muscles around it and just letting things soften and open up. And it can actually, it can induce visions, of course, in stronger doses, but it can also, I would think, with experience and practice, invite one into a state of nowness, or even I don't have a problem using the word peace, like, as it's really meant to be. Jesus is supposed to have made some reference to the peace that passes all understanding. In other words, there's no way to actually intellectually understand it, but you can experience it. And that is this place where there's no tension, there's no distracting thought, there's no worry, there's just you there, right there. And that is, I think, our ultimate potential, free of time and space, free of struggle of the ego, as it were. And cannabis can enhance or amplify that process. It's still a spiritual journey. It's not necessarily a shortcut or an easy thing to do. It's almost like, some of the presenters contributors in the book refer to it as an advanced spiritual medicine that way.
Well, and you've mentioned here some of the things that you do. I mean, we're talking about what's happening on the inside, but also the setting of it that you create on the outside. In our last episode together, you talked about a particular template that you used. You gave some examples here now too, but we also see that there's quite a long list of both traditional as well as contemporary ceremonial use of this medicine. Can you give us some examples that have been fleshed out from either your book or your own experiences of whether it's other cultures or people in our contemporary society that have structured ceremonies around or with cannabis?
Well, Chris Bennett, who's renowned, more or less, scholar on the history of cannabis and religion and ritual, has a chapter in the book called Venerable Traditions. He doesn't go into too much into the details of the practices, just points out that many cultures historically, more in Asia than anywhere else, have used this plant in various ceremonial ways. So that we don't take up all the time, I might give you an example of one or two of my favorites. One of them is not even really a story. It's just that it gets referenced here and there. In the Greek, I guess he was a philosopher, Herodotus, made reference to, this was, I don't remember the exact date, sometime before Jesus, the Christian era. I think maybe 500, 1,000 years prior to that. There were people over in Asia known as the Scythians, an area or region is called Scythia, Scythia, and they used it as a kind of they used cannabis in their funerary rites. And like after a funeral or something, they were known to have gathered in an interior space, presumably a small one, and thrown masses amount of the leaf on the fire. And then Herodotus makes a point of saying that then they howled in joy. So they just filled the whole room and got ridiculously, altered and to a sort of an ecstatic space.
If I can jump in real fast, it totally gave me a visceral image. There's a viral news video years ago of, it might have been in Asia, where these cops were burning all of this seized cannabis behind them. And all of a sudden the interviewer and the cop, they all just start giggling because the smoke is just blowing on everybody around them. Because they're like, oh, we'll just burn all this stuff up. But everybody was right there. So I'm sorry. It brought that very strong image but I can see that happening, and imagining a culture in ancient Greece just getting around and lighting a giant cannabis bonfire. Quite a sight.
The joys of secondhand smoke. Yeah. So another one that I think is very interesting, it's not so much a group ceremonial ritual, but there's a book, I don't know if I mentioned it last time, it's a really interesting book called Orgies of the Hemp Eaters, which is essentially a tongue-in-cheek title, by the way, based on some kind of nasty things that some right-winger kind of person had said about, orgies of the hemp eaters, So they took the title, and it's Hakim Bey and Abel Zug, or Zug, Z-U-G, are the editors of the book, and they collected a whole bunch of really interesting testimonials and writings. And one of the chapters, I forget the name of the chapter, but the author is Michael Aldrich, and he wrote about a practice from, I think, the 11th century in India called the Mahanirvana Tantra. Did I mention that last time? Does that ring a bell?
It does ring a bell. I'm vaguely familiar with that tantra, but not with the reference. So I'm curious. I'm excited to hear what you got to say.
Well, I think it's really interesting because if we're talking, we're really what this is all about is where are we going from here, right? Mm-hmm. How can we reintroduce cannabis as a spiritual ally into the culture to the extent that people are interested in working with it that way? I think it has immense potential. And in fact, that's another theme that I won't go right into right now, but cannabis and the future of religion altogether. So having examples from the past, and this is one of them, this Mahanirvana Tantra, first of all, it tells me how seriously people took their commitment to setting. You were talking about setting earlier, right? And set as well. So set, again, being, the mental state preparation and so on of the individual participant of, or seeker or whatever you want to call that. So in this particular one, as I recall it from Michael Aldrich's chapter, it was part of Buddhist tradition of the time, I believe, in India. And they prepared a yogin and a yogini. So there may be some connection to Hinduism too. Excuse me if I don't get the details right on all this. I'm sometimes going beyond the facts to get to the truth, really. Anyway, they prepared the young man and the young woman, the yogin and the yogini, for I think weeks. They would be doing a lot of extra meditation and fasting, and they'd be kept away from each other separately. And they'd be preparing for this ceremony that they would do. And this is in the context of the community where the monks are involved and there's a temple. And when they finally bring them together, they bring them together in what sort of superficially you might call sexual union. But the purpose is to completely step out of ego altogether and connect to the divine through the energy that's created by the union of these two people. And so the monks are around, they're supporting it. The actual session happens in the temple, and they drink a cannabis concoction, which, by the way, was probably fairly sophisticated in terms of what was in it. You look in some of the recipe books for these bhang lassis, and they knew how to add a variety of other herbs, some of which probably had potentiating or harmonious blending effects with the cannabis. So to me that, and so the ideal and supposedly the result of these sessions, this Mahanirvana Tantra practice, was truly full-on oneness with the divine, like realization of ultimate reality. So, it's a level of commitment that is fairly foreign to our kind of culture. Many of you might know yourself, Ashton, many of the indigenous cultures around the planet do similar similar kinds of thing. There's a group, I forget which one it is, the Warani maybe in the Amazon, that uses tobacco, which is, we won't go into it, but that's another example of a plant which has totally other, very different potential when it's used sacramentally than, what people understand it to be. It's a different strain of tobacco, for one thing.
The jungle tobacco from the Amazon, definitely different.
I think it's called rustica, Nicotiana rustica, something like that. And it's a much more nicotine in it, actually. So they say that, this is a chapter I read in a book one time, they would actually do the same kind of thing where they meditate for a couple of weeks ahead of time. And then they'd fire up some giant bong and smoke a large amount of it, so there's no food in the system getting in the way of it, which is often what happens with various entheogenic medicines. You get food out of the way as much as possible first. You fast for, 6 hours or even longer. And so the medicine can come in without the interference of all that other stuff going on in your body. And so they say that when they do that with the tobacco, with these giant bongs, they actually cross over to the completely other realms, the out of body experiences, connection with the spirit, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm rambling on about here is that we have the potential, if we can discipline ourselves to take cannabis seriously as a spiritual medicine, to create our own new sort of rituals for individual and group practice. Ralph Metzner, who I quoted in the book, was referring to psilocybin, which is in a somewhat similar situation in the fact that there's not a lot of information about existing rituals for group work with psilocybin. Got crushed, as the sweep of European, invasion went around the world. So what Ralph suggested was hybrid rituals, what he calls them, where you take your experiences from many different other contexts, many other rituals that you maybe have been involved with over the years and that other people have, and you start building new ones carefully. And so similar with cannabis, it's a flexible medicine. It's generally a fairly kind medicine and a gracious medicine. And we can combine other practices we've used, simple meditation, yoga, chant, shamanic drumming, etc., and develop our own rituals. You were asking about the template. In the book I put together a chapter, is that this is really just kind of a flexible open source template to be pushed, pulled, turned, upside down, whatever. That I'm not putting it out there carved in stone. People can find their own ways to work with this plant and incorporating those kinds of practices that I mentioned. I would just stress, though, from my point of view anyway, that the core wellspring that you ideally want to keep coming back to somehow and incorporate into your ritual practice is this ability to develop or to work on inner silence, inner stillness, because the more you can get yourself out of the way, in a sense, the less of me, the more the plant, the pure energy and brilliance actually of the plant can come through.
You mentioned as well, both in the context of bong lassis and some of the ingredients other than just cannabis that have gone into those, and you mentioned psilocybin, things like that. I'm curious about the history of this medicine being used with other plant medicines and kind of how that plays out. Both, as far as I know, there's not research about these sort of cannabis combined with other things, but just from the more anthropological sides of things, of where people have been using it and what they say about it, if they are mixing it with other entheogens or spiritual medicines.
Well, to be honest, Ashton, I'm more aware of more recent commingling of medicines, actually. 20th century and into the 21st century, of course. For example, some of the ayahuasca using religions from South America have combined the two, ayahuasca and cannabis. So I think the most important thing to say about that, if I may slightly riff off what your question is that cannabis can be very beneficial supporter of the use of other psychedelic or entheogenic medicines. It can have a variety of functions in that way. The way, as a kind of a starting point, the way I like to think of it is that when cannabis is used to support the effects of other entheogenic medicines, it's very humble and respectful. It doesn't sort of push its way in and say, here, I'm cannabis. You're now having a partial or cannabis experience. What it can do is, number one, it can potentiate the effects of the other medicine. I and other people have experienced with psilocybin mushrooms, for example, that you can, just briefly, I'll mention one experience I had where I had taken a smallish dose of psilocybin mushrooms, definitely enough to know they were there, but still kind of a somewhat gentle experience. And I then, like an hour and a half, 2 hours in, I had a couple of tokes on a joint, and right away, what I felt was it just doubled the effect of the psilocybin. It did not feel at all like a cannabis high. I knew cannabis well by then. I knew what its fingerprint is, and it didn't feel like a cannabis high. It felt like the same as what I'd already experienced that day with the psilocybin, but just stronger. Terence McKenna has talked about this as well. He said that when he uses these stronger doses of psilocybin, he'll often have a puff, some short, like within an hour maybe or something. And what he said is it prolongs and synergizes the visions of the medicine. The ayahuasca people find that it does that. And there's a beautiful Mariano da Silva in the book Cannabis and Spirituality has a beautiful little description. When they use it with their ayahuasca sessions, what they do is, these are group ceremonies, but he only brings in the cannabis, or what they call Santa Maria, when it's an intimate group of people that they really know can handle this. They don't do this in the larger, open, public type ayahuasca ceremonies they do. You really have to know who's there, and that they can handle the intensity, the increased power. So what they do is they do the ayahuasca at the beginning of their ceremony. These are like 5-6 hour ceremonies, 5-6-7 hour ceremonies. And then they do their songs and meditations and different things that they do. And then maybe 2-3 hours later, they'll have a second round of the ayahuasca. And when he has this kind of group, they will then have some cannabis. They'll smoke some cannabis. And he said, it's absolutely essential that it be done in external and internal silence, so that you can just feel it purely, like I said, no me in the way, so to speak. And then he said what happens is, it's like the ayahuasca takes you to the top of the mountain, and the Santa Maria gives you wings to fly in the wind. Beautiful image for me. But also it can, as Francisco, who also talks about the commingling of medicines in the book, says, the cannabis can sort of, without actually mitigating or diminishing the effects of the ayahuasca, it can smooth the effects to some degree and make it easier to process them in some ways, easier to process the insights. They also use it at the end of the ceremony occasionally because it helps, they find that the cannabis helps clarify their thinking when they're sort of doing a sharing session and talking about what they've learned during the ceremony. So cannabis can have potentiating effects in support of other medicines, and also sort of smoothing, calming effects. Very, very interesting plant that way. Just to finish that thought briefly, the recommendation generally is that you take the other medicine first, let its imprint or its character establish itself first, and then at some point, sooner or later, have a little cannabis with it. Again, very carefully, very, in a sense, disciplined way of doing this. We're talking ceremonial ritual use here.
Well, it's interesting too about the combination with ayahuasca, because you've actually interviewed in your book Hamilton Souther, who's an American who lived in the Amazon for a number of years, trained with a shaman, led journeys I actually drank with Hamilton and his maestro in a group. This was, somewhere around 2008, 2009. And something that I found interesting, because in your book, he's talking about cannabis, is that when I was down there, they were saying that, oh, no, cannabis isn't a good spirit ally. Tobacco's okay, but cannabis, no. And I remember thinking like, oh, well, that's kind of strange. They're sitting here like chain smoking tobacco, but cannabis is poo-pooed on, which, obviously it was either the influence of his teacher at the time, or he's changed his perspective on it. But I found that, I was like, oh, well, check that out. Is it that interesting? Because it was a 180 degree shift, because it was one of the things I remember working when I was on that, because that was my first experience with ayahuasca. I was like, oh, well, as someone who's an advocate of cannabis, I'm like, oh, for many of the reasons that you just spoke of, when working with other entheogens, it has both the potential to increase potency, but at the same time kind of smooth out the edges so it's not as rough. So it would seem like, especially with something like ayahuasca, that it can be beneficial if used appropriately. So when they said that, I was like, oh, that seems really weird. And then when I was reading your book, I was like, oh, that's such a strange shift, that it's such a 180 degree. So I'm fascinated about the context of ayahuasca use with something like cannabis, which interestingly enough too, I mean, most shaman is not a native South American word. It was imported obviously from anthropologists, and most of the shamans down there, they've got specific names. They're ayahuasqueros, they're vegelistas, there's all these different things. And vegelistas, for example, put all kinds of different medicines into their ayahuasca brews. Hamilton's maestro, I mean, he was a master vegelista, so we had all kinds of, we had daturas in there, we had barks, we had all kinds of different stuff that enhanced and shifted the characteristics of the medicine. And to me, it makes sense that cannabis, being such a wonderfully diverse medicine as it is a wonderful complement to that.
So there's a few things there. One is that some people believe, I'm not sure exactly what the scientific support for this would be, that cannabis sticks to the sort of etheric body, so to speak, for a long time. And so there's this belief in the Amazon, I'm not really extremely familiar with it, but I've definitely come across it, that cannabis can interfere with the sort of power and purity of the ayahuasca effects. I personally think that there's a degree, at least, of dogma associated with this. It's a belief rather than a confirmable experience, you know. I was at some ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru a few years ago where the shaman talked about that. But he also, that same guy, for what it's worth, also poo-pooed pretty much all the other entheogens and basically claimed that ayahuasca was really the only really, excellent one. He didn't seem to like psilocybin or any of the others either. Anyway, he had that view that it would interfere with the visions and so on. So in the morning, there was a fellow, we did the sharing session. There was a young man who said he'd been smoking a lot of pot up till quite recently, and he had all kinds of visions. So I don't know about that. And however, on the other hand, Mariano da Silva and his people, and Francisco and their people, when they're going to incorporate, even if they don't use cannabis, whether or not they're going to include cannabis in their ayahuasca ceremony, they will typically go on what they call a cannabis fast or a Santa Maria fast prior to the ceremony. And that can be anywhere from an absolute minimum of 3 days. They will always do that. Like I've been connected to the local Santo Daime group here, Santo Daime Church. And before they go into an Daime ayahuasca ceremony, their counsel to their community is, fast with cannabis at least 3 days, sometimes 5, 7. Mariano will sometimes go on a 21-day cannabis fast where there's none for 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes leading up to the ayahuasca ceremony. And that's whether or not they're going to do the cannabis as part of it. So there is this idea of kind of clearing out the system. If I'm not mistaken, cannabis THC or whatever can be identified in the spinal fluid at least a month after your last session or experience with it. So it does stick around in the body, so to speak. And they say it's referred to as sticky. I think I actually asked Hamilton that question too. And he sort of seemed to imply the same thing, kind of keep it out of the way a little bit if you're going to be doing ayahuasca for a while ahead of time. So there is that. But just generally, I don't buy the idea that it's just bad, for ayahuasca people at all.
So to shift gears a little bit, it touches on some things that you spoke earlier, but microdosing is all the rage these days, it seems like. I mean, there's some big articles recently in prominent news journals. It's definitely kind of picking up prominence, and this is obviously for people unfamiliar. It's using very low amounts of LSD to stimulate creativity. Cannabis seems to have been used, especially as to my knowledge in contemporary times, that is one of the big uses that people, artists in particular, use it for. Can you talk a little bit about the use of cannabis to stimulate creativity?
Sure. Well, just briefly on the microdosing issue, I haven't given a lot of thought to cannabis microdosing in the sort of literal sense of it. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think the definition of microdosing would be below this threshold of conscious awareness of the effect of the medicine.
Yeah. So the idea with that is that you're not really you're not having visions. You're not. Some people say that it makes things a little sharper. And I'm not saying microdosing cannabis, but just in the sense that a lot of people are doing that to stimulate new thought and creative thinking. And here we are, we've had cannabis, which that's been used, as far as just looking back at our recent modern history, where that's where a lot of people are using it for. So I found that interesting. Like, hey, people are doing that, but people have been doing that with cannabis for, at the very minimum, decades and decades.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Writers, artists of different kinds, comfortable with that. Yeah, so, coming back to that pharmacokinetic explanation that we addressed at the beginning of the conversation, if you take that kind of notion that there's an increase of the flow of freshly oxygenated, rich blood going through the whole system. I know one writer, I don't know if he wants me to use his name, so I won't, but he's an award-winning journalist and the author of 2 very popular books from major publishers. He said he writes high. He writes under the influence pretty much all the time. And as for me, that doesn't work so well. So I asked him how that works, why that works for him. And his just simple answer was, it's a vasodilator, which is essentially another way of saying what I just said from John Bello. So for him, he feels like it opens up the blood flow into the brain and stimulates, sharpness for him, which is, I find, a fascinating idea given the sort of, cultural disparagement of cannabis as the stoner drug and what were we just talking about kind of idea, right? But I think what's key there, or a couple of keys. One is, this is a very experienced person. He's been using cannabis for a very long time. He knows how to, I talked at the very beginning about channeling that energy. You've given this gift of enhanced or amplified energy. And then it's, what do you do with that gift then? Do you spill it off in a variety of directions, or do you actually focus it in on either emptying completely into spiritually opening, or into channeling, into your work, for example? So first of all, he's experienced. He knows how to work with the plant. And secondly, it wouldn't go into the category of microdosing. However, I would suspect, if I sat down with this gentleman again and said, what are you noticing about the effects of the cannabis? He would almost certainly say, because this is my experience, you don't really notice the effect of the cannabis all that much when you're focused. And if he's writing every day, which I assume he would be when he's working on a book, then presumably he's using cannabis every day. And when you're using cannabis every day, there's both a tolerance and a familiarization effect. So it actually becomes your normal experience. So it's not like you feel high. I know there's a local friend and colleague here in Vancouver who, he's 50 years old. He's a successful writer, businessman. He uses cannabis. At 10 in the morning, he has a 1 or 2 puffs on his vaporizer, and he'll do that once or twice during the day. So essentially, he's in a light high, probably not much above the kind of microdosing threshold all the time. And that works extremely well for him. That's another issue that we probably addressed in the previous talk, I don't recall at the moment, was frequency of use. But I'll just say briefly that there's a theme throughout the book, and one of my themes is that if you can use it less often, you're more likely to have sharper, deeper effects if you're using it for spiritual work. But that's not a judgment because, as I say, getting into these kind of zones. So this writer, it just sort of sharpens them up. The one I mentioned a moment ago just kind of sharpens them up a little bit. So that's pretty much, as I understand it. It allows people, here's the simple way of putting it, for creative work or just any work with cannabis, really, any skillful, directed work with cannabis. It allows you to go deeper into the focus of your attention. If you know how to use that skillfully, there's 2 people who've written about how they work with it creatively in the book, Floyd Salas and Svea Batch. Svea is a jeweler. So that's another point about using cannabis creatively, not necessarily effective with all aspects of the work. I quoted a fellow who's using the handle Herb Garden in the book, who says he's He claims to be a composer of classical music that's been performed by major orchestras in the United States. And he has a list, and I don't remember all the points right now, about 5 or 6 things that go well with creative things that go well with cannabis and things that don't. And the idea stage, that's the key one. Inspiration stage, things like that. Some of the more technical things, working with the computer. He said even sight reading is compromised. Sight reading of new, like unfamiliar material is compromised. So there are some dysfunctions involved with cannabis. It mitigates some brain functions to allow others to be enhanced. And Svea, again, one of the ways that she uses cannabis, one of the key ways, is she works with semi-precious and precious stones oftentimes and sets them in silver, rings and so on. She's described to me, she didn't go into it that much in the book. It's a very short chapter, but she's described to me how she'll have a whole bunch of stones there, and she'll sort of zone in on one on this particular day, for a particular piece. She'll go, there's like this magnetic thing going on, and she'll kind of really connect with that stone in a way that she would not normally.
Well, some of the stuff that you're talking about too, I'd imagine is also influenced by the strain. One of the things I noticed living in California we've had medicinal marijuana in dispensaries for a while now. It's kind of hard to get separate strains these days. It looks like everyone has blended everything, so everything is indica and sativa blend. But there is a very real and distinct difference in strains. We mentioned tobacco earlier, but in the strains of marijuana, the 2 main strains of the indica and the sativa, where I think the generally accepted idea is that sativas are more stimulating and indicas are a little bit more depressing, not in the sense of like making you sad, but in the sense that they stimulate you less. The easy image I say is like when someone wants to go and like clean their house or do something active, it's like the sativa is your thing. But if you're just it's a rainy day and you want to listen to music and eat food, well then sativa is probably not your thing. It's kind of the indica, and I don't know the science behind why those differences are. I'm sure it has to do with varying amounts of THC and things like that, and how that's then interacting with the brain. But that's I definitely noticed strain has a huge impact on people's experience and how people use it. I couldn't imagine someone being very productive if they've got tasks at hand, if they've smoked indica a lot. Or one of the things I want to actually talk to you about earlier when you had mentioned about strain, or when we were talking about this, is that the strength of strains and how that has changed over the past 10, 20 years, where now the emphasis is always on, it seems like, stronger, to my mind might not necessarily be beneficial. Do you feel like it's a race to the most powerful and pure sort of thing? Or is it like, hey, it's okay that there are these different grades, and it's not about blasting off into outer space all the time? As you mentioned throughout this entire conversation, all of these functional uses, or people that are highly functional people using it for different reasons, it seems to me that potency isn't the end-all be-all of the experience with strains.
No, the stronger the dosage, the less you want to be doing in general. The more you want to just be sort of keeping things super, super simple and just sitting meditation, or just keeping it super simple like that, because it does compromise some kinds of brain functions, as the dosage goes up. Yeah, that's a really interesting issue, and it's very complex, actually. It is an advanced spiritual medicine, and there's a lot to be learned from it. I've over the years, I feel like I've gradually refined and improved my understanding of how to work skillfully with cannabis, and I've actually had this image occasionally in my mind that it's like learning to fly an airplane. There's a lot of controls, so to speak, that you have to get to know. I believe I've read that there are over 1,000 chemicals to be in this plant, many of them unique to the plant, by the way. So we really, even our researchers and scientists who are diligently working away to understand this plant, have a lot more to learn about. So the tricky part often is, too, the combination and the interaction between all the different chemicals. This is a general problem with identifying the effects of drugs and so on. Is it, like some pharmaceutical, how is interacting with other drugs and your own endogenous system, et cetera, et cetera. It's complex. I agree with you about the general understanding of sativa versus indica. One thing I've come across fairly recently is the influence of a terpene in the plant called myrcene. I think it's pronounced myrcene or myrcene, but spelled Myrcene, myrcene or myrcene. Myrcene has sedative effects. It is often, I believe I read it's been found more often in the indica dominant strains. So that may have something to do with the soporific drowsy inducing effects of indica. I actually just last night was looking at temperatures for vaporizers, and this one website had some interesting things to say about that all the cannabinoids, or a number of the key cannabinoids, evaporate at different temperatures. According to that website, I'm going to have to give you Celsius numbers. Your listeners can translate for themselves. Take the Celsius number and multiply it by 9/5. And then add 32, because Celsius starts at 0 and Fahrenheit starts at 32. So like 30 degrees Celsius would be 9/5 plus 32, right? So like 30 degrees Celsius is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, for example. But anyway, at 157 degrees Celsius, THC evaporates. CBD between 160 to 180. So, it takes higher temperatures to release CBD. And then that's another important cannabinoid too, of course, because CBD actually mitigates the effects of the high from THC. And that's, so it has these calming, relaxing effects, and both mitigates, but also extends in duration, in time, the effects of THC. So it has some very interesting and synergistic interaction with THC that way, but can also influence the strength of it. And also can, for some people, reduce the levels of paranoia and anxiety that can be generated by THC. So when you said, this, race for the strongest, yeah, there's problems with that. That's not necessarily based on understanding the spiritual benefits of this plant. These shatters and things like that, they can get up, I've heard up to 75% THC. I don't think that's a great idea. They've been breeding out CBD in a lot of the strains, and that may not be, there's definite indications that may not be a good idea. And then the same website I mentioned that I was looking at last night, there's some other cannabinoids and chemicals that are released or evaporate at higher temperatures, some of which also have some kind of sedative effects. So the bottom line on all this, if it sounds too complicated to your listeners, is experiment. As you say, everything's a hybrid these days anyway. So what I would suggest to people is, especially if they're not really familiar with the effects of cannabis, if they're newer especially, but just in general, anyone, start small if you're going to use it for spiritual benefit, meditation, and so on. What I like to say is the optimal dosage, one way of looking at the optimal dosage for cannabis is the dosage that you can both handle and want to handle. So that a very gentle caress can be very effective for just calming you down and allow you to meditate and be present. You don't even like the word meditation, just be present and calm. But then you can go into deeper exploration. So, but the borderline, so to speak, or the cutoff point, as it were, would be the point beyond which you can't handle physically and mentally. Okay, so if you get anxious, paranoid, dizzy, nauseous, et cetera, you either have taken too much or you haven't learned how to channel that degree of power. That actually applies to all the entheogens in the sense that it takes skill and experience and courage, actually, to be able to release and surrender into stronger dosages.
So, Stephen, I want to jump in because we are reaching towards the end of our time here. And I know you had mentioned earlier in our chat, too, about talking about the future of religion and cannabis use. And I want to give an opportunity for you just to tie it all in, because I think it brings us to that point of what's next now. Now with all these legalization measures and all the stuff that's happening, where does it go from here? I mean, we see a lot of cultures integrating or a lot of people integrating cannabis into various religious practice, spiritual practices. So where does this go from here at this point?
Well, I'm very optimistic, Ashton. And I mentioned this notion of hybrid rituals. We're at a unique point in history where we don't have the kind of cultural underpinnings for, firmly established ritual ceremonial use of cannabis as a spiritual medicine. But it's a safe plant to work with that way. And we can find out for ourselves and develop them. I think there's a sort of an inevitable trajectory in culture where people start religions and they eventually become hidebound and dogmatic. So my hope would be that does not happen with cannabis. There are churches around. There's the First Cannabis Church of Oregon. There's the First Cannabis Church of Alabama. And there's a number of these kind of places. I would just hope that these people would keep the dogma out of it. Let the teachings of the medicine of direct experience be the whole underpinning of the whole thing. It's like Ganesh Baba, who I quote in the book, he said he has two rules. His whole life he was using cannabis as a spiritual substance, and his canon, as it were, was two things: sit up straight, spine perfectly aligned, and dedicate your smoking to Shiva, or I would say any source, deity, that makes sense to you. So in other words, treat it reverently and respectfully. And as Kathleen Harrison says in her chapter, it has more to give when you treat it like that. So if we're going to have rituals, they can go lots of different ways. I would always say, as I say, the core, the ground of everything is inner silence. All the spiritual teachings, all the great spiritual teachings understand this, that reality, unconditioned reality, enlightenment, so to speak, is uncovered as we get ourselves out of our own way. We have to get out of our thoughts to some degree to allow that gap to happen. Leonard Cohen said there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So so a couple of the contributors to the book talk about cannabis as the sacrament of peace, because it has this potential to allow us to open our hearts, be more compassionate, be more calm, and trust. This is really key, I think. The cannabis can teach you over a period of time. Joan Bellows stresses it's not just about the sort of, immediate experience of the high, which fades quickly, right? It's a gradual shifting of the way that we are in the world, which is trusting the intelligence of the moment. That's a core Buddhist teaching too. It's called primordial intelligence or unconditional intelligence. We all have that capability if we can get the concepts and beliefs and narratives and blockages all out of the way, so to speak, as we work our way through them. So cannabis, because of its amplification capabilities, has this potential to deepen and enhance spiritual practice, and in a non-dogmatic, non-overly structured way. Keep it open. Stephen Hager has a lovely little short chapter in the book called The New Pot Enlightenment. Keep it spontaneous, keep it light. Don't create hierarchies where somebody's the great, hierophant or whatever.
I'm a better pot smoker than you, so I get to be on top.
Oh yeah, I'm just like the elder, I'm the leader, It's an egalitarian kind of situation. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a big question, and I certainly don't have the answers. But I think if we're going to have religious, spiritual kind of ritual experiences, I would just hope that people would stay relaxed about it and not create a bunch of dogma and a whole bunch of rules for people. Keep it egalitarian. I know you're coming to an end. I'll just say this really briefly. This is the big reason why I kind of morphed out of 20 years or so with Tibetan Buddhism into my involvement with the psychedelic medicines. I got a little tired of hearing about the frailties of human people in those roles of power. And when you meet the medicines, you're just meeting your own inner divine sense directly without the intermediary effect of people, so to speak, although container and, experienced people can be really important, etc. But the future is, to me, about everybody being able to be empowered through their own direct experience. And again, very simply put, cannabis can enhance and deepen and amplify that potential.
So, Stephen, you've got your website, cannabisandspirituality.com. You're also going to be starting up a tour here with a number of different conferences and things. Tell us a little bit about the best ways to connect with you and some of the upcoming things that you've got going on.
Thanks so much for asking. Yes, on my website, cannabisandspirituality.com, there's an events media page, and there's a listing of the book talks and things that I'm going to be doing down the coast in the month of April and some into May as well. So I'm doing one in Eugene at Stargate, or sponsored by Stargate Bookstore, April 5th. The following night in Ashland at Bloomsbury Books. These are free events. These are all free events, by the way. And if anyone hears this and comes to any of those, please introduce yourself and say, hey, I heard you on Ashton Zabos. I'd love to talk to you. And I love talking about these things, as you probably noticed. So I'm really going to enjoy these experiences. And there will be copies of the book for people to buy either through the bookstore or through me. So there's Ashland on the 6th. And then another one in Ashland at Jackson Wellsprings. This is all on the website. April 11th. There's going to be a really excellent one in Occidental, California, which is the home of Kathleen Harrison. And she and Martin A. Lee, the author of Smoke Signals, fantastic writer and the head of Project CBD, is also, the three of us are going to take turns speaking at a 3-hour event in Occidental on the April 15th. I don't have a website or any links for that particularly, but the information will be on my website. And then I'm going to be at the Oakland conference, the Psychedelic Science 2017. There's a sort of side program called Symposia Stage, and Lex Pelger is one of the organizers of that, and he's going to interview me on stage. And then finally, on the way back up, I'm going to do a little one in Arcata, California, at Northtown Books. And then in May, I'm doing one Village Books in Bellingham on the 20th, and on the 22nd, I'm doing one at Powell's Books in Portland, the Hawthorne location. They have 2 or 3. I doubt that anyone's going to remember all that, but it's all on my website.
Great. Well, as a quick little jump in with Arcata, because I love Arcata. A number of years back, the city of Arcata won an award from, I forgot which company it was, for buying and purchasing the most turkey bags. And so the company sort of announced Arcata as this award winner, and then they realized what everybody was using the turkey bags for in Arcata, because there's such a huge cannabis growing population there that they actually ended up rescinding that whole thing. But I think there's a few hubs of cannabis cultivation, and particularly in the United States, but in the world, and Arcata is one of them. There's a lot of it there, so I'm sure they're very receptive to those conversations.
It'll be like going into a club of fishermen to talk about fishing.
Yeah.
They'll already know about it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Stephen, thanks for coming on the show and chatting with us again. I really appreciate it. I encourage people to go out and get your book, as well as stay in touch with what the work that you are doing, because I think it's awesome. I think it's great to bring these things to the public conversation more. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for your interest in all that, Ashton.
And for all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've learned something new today. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there, as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.